I run a podcast, as many of you know, called Tap Calf Transmissions. It's basically a Star Wars book club, and this isn't a sponsored segment. It relates to the topic because in our most recent episode, which I will link below, we covered the novel Rogue Planet. Rogue Planet's a really interesting novel. It follows Anakin and Obi-Wan as they track and eventually travel to the mysterious planet of Xenoma-Seacot, and having released in 2000, it ties in with both the prequels, which of course were releasing at that time, but also the other major Star Wars project of that era, the New Jedi Order, i.e. the novels telling the story of the Yuuzhan Vong War. Rogue Planet takes place only, I think it's 3 years after The Phantom Menace, but ties in with the Yuuzhan Vong War over 50 years later, with Xenoma-Seacot playing a major role in the eventual defeat of the Yuuzhan Vong. We see characters like Vergere and Jabbatha appear, but that's really a story for another day. Check out the podcast if you're interested. The position in the timeline is interesting not only because of how it ties into both bits of media, but also because it is a prequel work free of any of the influence of Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. This will be relevant as we talk the Forces of the Republic, but as an example, Greg Bear, the author, wrote it so that the Trade Federation was in the midst of surrendering their forces to the Republic, something which other works in this time period, or at least the Clone Wars time period, don't really pick up on. You have to really imagine how different the prequel era was after Attack of the Clones compared to after The Phantom Menace. Not just in terms of plot, but also in tone. Anyway, this is all relevant because Rogue Planet gives us more of an insight into the pre-Clone Wars Republic. A Republic which, at this point, is actually still really feeling the pressure of the things which would go on to cause the Clone Wars. A loss of security and faith in the Republic in outlying systems, an increase in piracy, and more. So what's the Republic military, and specifically their navy, look like at this point? Well, as mentioned, the Republic is in the process of nationalizing the navy of the Trade Federation. We hear of fleets and task forces being transferred into Republic control, and that does play into the plot of the novel somewhat. But obviously, this is not something we see in the Republic throughout the rest of Star Wars Legends, and really, you can hand-wave that away with the same tools you hand-wave away the decline of the Trade Federation, including the arrest of Newt Gunray and others at the end of The Phantom Menace, and just say, well, Palpatine or Republic corruption took care of it. Yes, the Trade Federation was punished shortly after the blockade of Naboo, but after a while, they got all their stuff back and they become strong again by the time of the Clone Wars. Otherwise, in terms of Republic forces, the novel also makes reference to another famous Star Wars Expanded Universe story, the most famous story, in fact, the Thrawn trilogy. The novel specifically references that the Dreadnought was one of the Republic's few warships, and their most powerful one. Now, compared to a Venator-class Star Destroyer, the Dreadnought is nothing to write home about, but you have to remember, in the 1,000 years leading up to the Clone Wars, the galaxy was heavily demilitarized through the Ruusan Reformation. What's more, the Republic itself also dissolved most of their military, which we're going to have to talk about in just a second. The Republic did, however, have Dreadnought forces. And again, the small Dreadnought cruiser, not Dreadnought as a term for a large Star Destroyer. In the Thrawn trilogy, we learn of the Katana fleet, 200 Dreadnought-class heavy cruisers relying heavily on automation and slave-circuited technology to reduce crew requirements, which themselves were lost after the crews infected by a virus jumped the ships randomly into hyperspace. But, according to the novel, they did have other Dreadnought-class heavy cruisers, which makes sense, given that the Republic's outbound flight project was made up of several Dreadnought-class heavy cruisers, and that took place a couple of years ago after the event of Rogue Planet. Not many people look back on the Republic Navy in the years preceding the Clone Wars with really any sort of fond memories, but if there's one ship which represents that era, it would be the Dreadnought. This is part of the reason why, during the launch of the Clone Wars, both the Republic and the CIS are using basically brand new capital ships. But what else existed in that era? Well, many of you have heard of the Ruusan Reformations after the Battle of Ruusan, and what what was thought to be the ultimate defeat of the Sith, the Ruusan Reformations were signed, seeking to not only scale down conflict across the galaxy, but also, and I quote from the Essential Guide to Warfare, voluntarily dismantle central authority over economic, political, and military power. In terms of military, this meant, for all intents and purposes, the Republic's military was disbanded and reorganized into the judicial forces. Judicial forces were small, light fleets designed to respond quickly to events and not capable of fighting really anything larger than a very small skirmish. Additionally, the galaxy at whole had limits placed on ship weaponry and arms. Cruisers more than 600 meters long were limited to very slow Class 5 hyperdrives and were prohibited from leaving local systems. The idea was that the Republic would cede its power and that systems instead would build up fleets primarily for defensive purposes, hence the restriction on hyperdrive. You still did see some planets and systems like Kuat build massive kilometer-long plus vessels, but again, without a hyperdrive, they were more showpiece than anything else. What this also practically meant for the Republic military is that in times of extreme crisis, if the Mandalorians or the Hutts or whoever else needed to be slapped around a little, they would instead pull from planetary forces. Systems within the Republic would lend their ships and fleets to the Republic for a purpose which would presumably benefit all. But in the 1,000 years after Ruusan till the Clone Wars, there really was not a major crisis where massive fleets needed to be organized in any way. All of this so far, except of course what came directly from the Phantom Menace, is material from Star Wars Legends, but the High Republic really has placed the same rules on the Republic. And in fact, in the very first High Republic novel, Light of the Jedi, we see the Republic fight a battle with forces loaned from, I believe, Ariadu. Working in tandem with the Republic was, of course, the Jedi. They had more forces too pre-Ruusan, but also seeing the Republic pretty much fully disarmed, we learn in Rogue Planet that they rely largely on donors and friends of the Order to help them do their business. That being said, even before the Clone Wars, things were starting to change. I mentioned the Dreadnought fleets, the nationalizing of the Trade Federation fleets. Tarkin himself also tells Wraith Sinar that things are changing and that the era of large ships and power is on the horizon. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Really all I got. Let me know your thoughts on the pre-Clone Wars, post-Old Republic, era Republic, and if there's anything you'd like to see me cover in a future video. Until next time, may the Force be with you.